Hey everybody, Mr. Mack here with part one of a two-part series called Man, Myth, or Legend. Today's lesson is going to be about Franklin Delano Roosevelt. The next lesson is going to be about JFK. And the reason I'm doing these Man, Myth, or Legend series is because I want to look at these iconic presidents that have almost achieved godlike status in our history, in America's culture, and just sort of see, do they live up to the hype? Is what we think about them deserved? So starting today with Franklin Roosevelt. The big thing you need to know right off the bat about Franklin Roosevelt is that last name. When you are born with the last name Roosevelt, you are born into privilege in a couple of ways. The first is that your family has a ton of money. Franklin Roosevelt's family was extremely rich, but also you have privilege in the sense that you are a recognizable, notable name. Franklin Roosevelt is the fifth cousin of Theodore Roosevelt. Theodore Roosevelt actually is the one who walked the bride down the aisle at Franklin Roosevelt's wedding. Franklin Roosevelt's bride was a woman named Eleanor Roosevelt. She was the niece of Theodore Roosevelt. So for those of you keeping score at home, Franklin Roosevelt did marry a distant cousin. It was a different time, and her name would have been Eleanor Roosevelt. But Franklin Roosevelt, as I said, was a Roosevelt. And more than anything else in his early life, he had that going for him. Now, speaking of his early life, Franklin Roosevelt really never excelled at much except politics. He did go to Harvard, but he was a pretty unexceptional student. And as he grows up, it's really not assumed that he's going to do nearly as much as his cousin Theodore. But Franklin Roosevelt, from the time that he was very, very young, had his eye on the presidency. While he wasn't a particularly inspiring human at first, he knew that he wanted to be president one day, and he was going to work until he got there. So Franklin Roosevelt, since we're sort of studying his presidential legacy, I'll stop with the biography now and really get into that presidency. Franklin Roosevelt becomes president in 1932. Well, he gets elected in 1932, assumes the presidency in 1933 in the midst of the Great Depression. Interestingly enough, Franklin Roosevelt ran for vice president in 1920. He was on the ticket running against Warren Harding, who would eventually win. But Franklin Roosevelt doesn't win as vice president in 1920. He goes and becomes governor of New York, and then eventually he becomes president. When he becomes president, Franklin Roosevelt goes into gear. Now, there's this idea about Herbert Hoover, who was the guy who really was the face of the Great Depression as far as presidents go. You know, whenever people were living in just old, decrepit box houses, they called them Hoovervilles. And Herbert Hoover, there's this idea that he didn't do anything to help the Great Depression, but he did. He really tried. But Franklin Roosevelt is the one who gets stuff done. And this is where we get into the man, myth, or legend. Franklin Roosevelt's ability to get stuff done is definitely legendary. In his first 100 days, he passed 15 major acts to get people back to work. He starts spending government money to give people jobs. He gets Social Security passed. He does a bank holiday to allow the banks to go and get their reserve money and get their affairs in order so that they can get themselves together after the monstrous crash in 1929. Another major legacy of FDR, the New Deal. Those 15 acts that got passed were part of the New Deal. And whenever I think about FDR's presidency, I think of this kind of old. It's just about a cliche, but it's sort of a little story, if you've ever heard it, about the two mice that fall into a bowl of milk. One of the mice sort of gives up and drowns, and that's Herbert Hoover in this story. The idea is that Herbert Hoover just wasn't able to get done what he needed to get done to get America out of the Great Depression. Now, that second mouse, he fell into the milk, and he kept churning his legs, and he churned the milk into butter and got out. That would be Franklin Roosevelt in this story. You can feel how you want about Franklin Roosevelt, but the fact is that he tried anything that he could to get America out of the Great Depression. Now, Franklin Roosevelt was a Democrat. FDR was a Democrat, and he defined the Democrat Party for, you could even say today, but at least the next 30 to 40 years. New Deal Democrats in the New Deal coalition are going to define the Democrat Party. Now, on top of just the New Deal, which was a humongous deal, no pun intended, as it was, and that was partially responsible for getting America out of the Great Depression, FDR really became a legend because of his leadership during World War II. FDR is the man who was president of America when we got attacked at Pearl Harbor, and there's a pretty good idea, and it's probably true, that FDR wanted to get into World War II. He saw a lot of benefits in getting into World War II, but really didn't have a reason. But when Pearl Harbor gets attacked, 97% of Americans support America's entry into the war, and that's the famous December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy speech. That's FDR. And he leads America through World War II until his death. Now, this is where we start to get into the slightly more negative, and this is where we started to maybe even start to get into the myth of Franklin Roosevelt. Franklin Roosevelt was known as a very secretive and sort of duplicitous, just about two-faced person, and he often would tell his aides one thing and then tell another aide a different thing. And again, remember, he never excelled except when he got to the presidency. And if we're being totally honest, if he didn't have that last name, he may never have gotten to the presidency. He may have been just a guy. He may have just been a guy who practiced law for his entire life, if he even got to that point. Now, he was exceptional in the presidency in the way that he did things, but maybe he would have never even gotten there if he didn't have that last name, Roosevelt. Another big thing that Roosevelt, I wouldn't say he kept it secret, but he definitely didn't talk about it much, was the fact that he was paralyzed. Now, this was actually more because of a political reality. The fact is that at the time, people didn't want to have a paralyzed president. In this day and age, we would think that was fine. But at the time, people didn't want a paralyzed president. And so Franklin Roosevelt, usually people had to shut off their cameras whenever he got out of the car, and he would often sort of make it seem like he was walking. But Franklin Roosevelt contracted polio as an adult and was almost completely paralyzed for a while, but eventually the paralysis was only in his legs, and it's really just gonna wreck his body. The Roosevelts all had major health problems. Theodore Roosevelt died relatively young. He didn't live to be 65, and bad health was kind of a common theme in the Roosevelt family, and Theodore was no exception. Now, one of the big controversial things about Franklin Roosevelt's presidency was that he served 4 terms. Remember, at the time, it was just a tradition to only serve 2 terms. You could serve, as many terms as you want. The only reason why Franklin Roosevelt ever left office was because he died and Harry Truman took over. He served 4 terms, and whenever he was in power as president, he brought all kinds of power to himself, to the presidency. He spent money that America didn't have, and we still do that to this day. That's one of the biggest things, the biggest legacies of FDR, is that America still does what we call deficit spending money that we don't actually have and going into debt in order to do it. So that's a big thing. And another thing is court packing. He tries to essentially extend the Supreme Court so that he can get more of his New Deal programs through. Now, this ultimately doesn't work, but he tries. And so he's definitely a guy who wanted to have a lot of power. Now, you might say to that, well, if you've got a great president in there, which he was, if you've got a great president, we want him to have power. But remember, and this might be a little bit controversial to say, but Franklin Roosevelt sort of becomes the closest thing that America ever has to a king. Another really important thing that certainly can't be dismissed or written off was the internment of Japanese citizens during World War II. This wasn't just new immigrants or people who weren't citizens yet. These are people who were born in America but happened to be of Japanese descent. They were interned because Americans didn't know where their loyalties lied necessarily. And FDR is the president who presided over that. Now, one of the reasons why you tend to see this almost godlike stature in Franklin Roosevelt is because he is a wartime president who died while he was in office. And there's a great book called The Roosevelt Myth by a guy named John T. Flynn. And I'll read you a quote from it. He says, "The war played havoc with history writing after 1940. Not only did a great curtain of secrecy come down upon performers in the drama of the war, but their portraits and their actions were presented to us through the movies, the radio, and the press upon a heroic scale as part of the business of selling the warriors and the statesmen in the war to the people. Their blunders and their quarrels were blotted out of the picture. Only the bright features were left." So again, this sort of tells you that Franklin Roosevelt was intentionally made into a larger-than-life figure while America was at war. So now we get to the question. Franklin D. Roosevelt, FDR, man, myth, or legend? As with all things, obviously the truth is somewhere in the middle. Franklin Roosevelt definitely had his flaws. And if you are not a fan of big government, because Franklin Roosevelt, remember the Social Security, government handouts, Lyndon Johnson's Great Society never happens if Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal never happens. If you're not a fan of big government, you're probably not a big fan of Franklin Roosevelt. But I have to say, Franklin Roosevelt is one of the few presidents that I would say really lives up to that legend status. He did so much to bring power to the presidency, which you may say is a good or a bad thing, but he also brought a lot of power to the United States, and he is the president who leads us out of the Great Depression through the New Deal and our entry into World War II, and he was the steady hand that America needed during World War II. Now, there are no kings in America's system, but as I said earlier, Franklin Roosevelt probably comes the closest, and he is that mouse that churned the milk into butter. He saw a bad situation, and he did whatever he had to do by hook or by crook to get America out of it. So I would say that this comes down to, obviously, Franklin Roosevelt was a man. He was a flawed man, but he is just about as close to a legend as America's system allows a president to get.